The 1930s and 40s were an interesting time to be alive. The Great Depression, Hitler's rise to power, World War II, it was one of the scariest moments in history to live through, and it just so happens that the horror industry was thriving during this time. Throughout what we call the Golden Age, Universal Studios ruled horror. However, there were a lot of major horror successes from other studios. The Golden Age is when all of the classics were born, such as Dracula, Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde, and so many more.
I bid you welcome.
On Valentine's Day 1931, Universal released the first ever sound horror film, Dracula. While this isn't the first Dracula film, it's the one that made him an icon thanks to the incredible performance by Bela Lugosi. Think about everything you know about Dracula. The eyes, the voice, the hair, the clothes. Almost all of what you associate with Dracula comes from Bela Lugosi. There were two versions of this film made, the normal English-speaking version and the Spanish version, which was made alongside it. Many would say that the Spanish version is the superior film, but there's one thing it doesn't have: Bela Lugosi. Much like Caligari and Nosferatu, Dracula pulls you into the film by giving it a dreamlike trance. The film is silent for a lot of its runtime too. In the early days of sound film, they didn't think to put background music in the films. Why should they? The ability to have sound at all was impressive enough. So anytime a character isn't speaking in Dracula or a lot of these early 1930s films, it's as silent as can be, which in some cases does help the film with its dreamlike quality. Dracula also gave us a lot of iconic atmosphere that horror has been using since then, such as fog, the dark castles, cobweb, wolves, you name it.
It's moving. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. Oh, in the name of God. Now I know what it feels like to be God.
Following the major success of Dracula, Universal quickly sent Frankenstein into production. Initially, Universal had hoped that Bela Lugosi would return to play the monster, but he denied the role, thinking it was too degrading for a star like him. So Universal cast actor Boris Karloff in the role. To say that Frankenstein is one of the most iconic films ever made is a bit of an understatement. Absolutely everything about this film has become instantly iconic, from Frankenstein and his assistant digging up graves, to the assistant getting the wrong brain, to the creation scene, to the scene with the little girl, and the finale at the windmill. Every moment is memorable and ingrained within our culture. Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi would go on to be the two big horror stars of the decade, appearing in tons of films throughout the 30s. From here, Universal would go on to make tons of classic monsters, some from literature and some from European tales. This is when all of the classic monsters started to be born, like the Mummy, the Invisible Man, and the Wolf Man. Universal were the kings of horror, but there would be one film that would change all of that.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, before I tell you any more, I'm going to show you the greatest thing your eyes have ever beheld. He was a king and a god in the world he knew. But now he comes to civilization, merely a captive, a show to gratify your curiosity. Ladies and gentlemen, look at Kong, the eighth wonder of the world.
In 1933, the world of film was flipped upside down by a little film called King Kong. It would be impossible to talk about any genre from the 30s without mentioning Kong. This film changed absolutely everything. Kong exists in unique ways, merging many genres like adventure, fantasy, horror, romance, and action. It's a great film that would basically pioneer the entire special effects industry. Rear projection, matte paintings, animatronics, stop motion, miniatures. For 1933, this film is beyond impressive. There are not many films I think I could praise more than I praise King Kong. It hit every single genre in film like a truck. Beyond the wild special effects, this film did something huge. It had a full soundtrack. It's such a simple idea, but this was game-changing. No matter how great the huge selection of horror films from the 1930s was, nothing could lay a finger on Kong, a film that I would be fully ready to argue is the greatest film of all time.
We're millionaires, boys. I'll share it with all of you. Why, in a few months it'll be up in lights on Broadway. Kong, the eighth wonder of the world!
By the 1940s, the monsters in movies that had given audiences nightmares only years ago would lose their touch. Nobody on Earth was ready for the horrors of World War II. So when audiences would go to the theater, horror movies just couldn't do it for them anymore. Throughout the 1940s, horror had to evolve in order to survive. So what did Universal do? They quickly changed their old monsters by having them appear in these big monster battle movies like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, or having them appear in comedies, often with comedians like Abbott and Costello. This was when horror comedies were born, and by the end of the decade, horror had survived and was preparing to make a huge comeback. But no longer were the tales of European legend what kept people up at night. The world had entered the atomic age, and horror was about to enter the silver age.